Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for being here, and welcome to the first session of this spring's Education Policy Colloquium series, sponsored by the Program on Education Policy and Governance. My name is Jim Pizer. I'm an academic visitor here at the Kennedy School and former Secretary of Education in Massachusetts. It's an honor to be working alongside Professors Paul Peterson and Marty West, who's here with us today. I don't know if Paul's online or not, but hopefully he may be able to join us from California. In addition to today's event, we have 7 more sessions this semester on most Thursdays, not all Thursdays. I think just maybe it's during the vacation week. We don't have one of these, and mostly here at Taubman, although we may have 1 or 2 in other places. Some of the topics we'll be discussing with an impressive slate of scholars and practitioners includes high dosage tutoring, chronic absenteeism, new approaches to analyzing student test data, effectiveness of preschool, teacher diversity, and the sort of state of post-COVID academic recovery. And a full listing is on the PEPG website, so check it out. It'll have the times, speakers, and titles. Our next session is next Thursday, February 29th, and it'll feature Stephen Wilson, who is a serial charter school founder and author who is writing what I think is his 3rd book. And the title of Stephen's session will be Have Urban Charter Schools Lost Their Way? So I hope you'll be able to join us for that session and all the others that follow this spring. Today's session is focused on what has been called the impending fiscal cliff that is fast approaching over the next 6 months as the supplementary COVID funding, federal COVID funding called ESSER expires. And more specifically, what schools and districts are doing or have done or should be doing about this fiscal challenge that's confronting them. We're fortunate to have Karen Hawley Miles here today as our speaker to help us understand what's actually happening on the ground, especially with regard to budgetary and staffing strategies that promise not only to mitigate the pain associated with the end of ESSER, but hopefully to leave schools and districts in a stronger position and more efficiently and effectively support and accelerate student learning. As you'll hear, it's probably a little bit of a mixed bag depending on where you're looking, but I think as Karen will indicate, there are some hopeful signs and strategies that are out there. Karen is the CEO of Education Resource Strategies, which works with school systems nationwide to analyze and improve their funding systems, school level resource use, and human capital and professional development systems. Karen and ERS have developed a particular expertise with regard to the restructuring of the school day, the effective use of technology, and rethinking the roles and schedules of teachers. In other words, Karen doesn't just talk about school reform like some of us in this room might do, but she actually works with schools to do the hard work of change and improvement, which is why her perspective on policy and practice is so important. After Karen's comments, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers, discussion. And although we'll give priority to folks in the room, to the extent we have people online, we'll try to integrate them into the conversation. So if you are watching online, please put into the chat any questions you might have, and we'll try to get to you. The session is being recorded and will be posted on the PEPG website shortly thereafter, or after today. So in effect, we're all on the record here, so keep that in mind too. And with that, it's my privilege to turn the program over to Karen Hawley Miles.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Before I get going, I just want to get a sense of who's in the room. How many of you feel like you know ESSER and you've been thinking about it a lot and federal funding related to high poverty schools? Cool. Okay. How many of you are coming to this with an education leadership sort of focus versus a policy focus? Okay. And then policy is the rest of you all? Okay, great. Good to know. So we can delve into questions about the specifics that I will sort of modify in that way. So I'm going to tell you what I want you to hear first, and then I will go in detail about what about why I'm saying this. So if I leave you with one idea to keep thinking about, it is that we are at a crossroads with K-12 education in America that threatens the future of our democracy. because the pandemic has exacerbated divides that between the haves and have-nots that existed before the pandemic and continue onward. The federal funds have given an opportunity to sort of delay some of the changes that needed to be made, kick some of them down the road, if you will, because it wasn't possible to actually deal with those things during this time. But as I will show you, many of the districts that that emerged from the pandemic are still in as tough a place or worse than they went into the pandemic with. The bright side of this story is that the federal funds did enable districts in many cases to come through in ways that enabled them to sustain or even improve student performance. And it unleashed a host of innovations and new sets of practices that could be built on and used for the future. But the question is, with the cliff coming, with the loss of those resources facing us coming ahead, will we go back to the cut off of a system that doesn't work, making it worse? Or will we use this moment of innovation and disruption to say, finally, let's organize schools in ways that work for kids, that are consistent with research, and that begin to not just close the gap, but raise the bar. And we know from research and from the bright spots that exist all over the country that we can get there from here, but we don't have examples of doing that at scale. And that's going to require very different ways of both funding school systems and supporting schools to organize resources very differently. And many of the conversations that talk about how much don't talk about how well and the way we need to structure those things in order to change that. And we didn't get at the how we organize resources, people, time, and money during the pandemic. We did get at some other pieces of that. So that's my overall message. I'm hoping I'm giving you a lot of data to reinforce that and prompt some questions for you to go to our website and see more about. So the ESSER funding gave $190 billion to schools over a 4-year period. It ends in September, at which time districts have to obligate that spending, sort of say what they're going to do about it and have it be in there. It was intended to be used for emergency things like masks and plexiglass dividers and things like that that needed to happen related to the COVID pandemic, as well as 20% only was required to be used for academic recovery. Our early analysis of that suggests that districts used a lot more than that for academic recovery. We knew going into this that we would have some districts that just added a bunch on top, got to 24, and then had to make big, and are facing coming up big cliff. We hoped that we would have some districts that were scenario 3. And we organized and worked with a cohort of leading edge districts around the nation to work with them over this 4-year period, to work with them sharing tools, but also sharing lessons across tools to think about how could you invest in recovery strategies that hopefully will not need to be able to continue, as well as redesign strategies. How can we invest some of that money now in ways where we're building towards something that actually looks different when we're done? And so we worked over those last 4 years and are still working now and have all sorts of tools about how you might actually organize to do that. We know that some states and districts will face a much steeper cliff than others. The dollars were allocated out on a per pupil basis based on the number of students in poverty. And so, do the numbers. It means if you have a high concentration of poverty, you got a ton of money. You may know that Title I dollars and these dollars are not adjusted by the spending level in a district or by the geographic cost of living, which means, if you're a math person, which means that if you're in Mississippi or Alabama, those dollars make up a big percentage of your money because the spending is low and the cost of living is much lower. So in districts like Jackson, Mississippi, for an example, their operating budget went up by 20%, actually 25% a year if they had spread it over that period of time evenly, which they weren't able to do because it took a while to spend the money. So, and this happened all over the country in the highest poverty, lowest funding districts. In districts in Massachusetts, that number varies more like between 5 and 11% if they were to have spread it over because poverty isn't as concentrated and because the spending starts at a much higher level. So just to give you a sense, this is a huge deal, right? I mean, 20%, just think of having, you know, a business having 25% more and figuring out how to spend that in powerful ways in a short period of time. So how did many districts approach it? What we know is that many district leaders took a what I call on top of approach, right? And this is not meant to be in any sort of blaming way. Picture back to how we all felt right then. I mean, it was nuts. We didn't know whether we were going to go to school, who was going to be alive in these, you know, it was nuts. The idea that we naively went in there and we're like, you should be planning a 4-year strategy and like, let's figure out what your do now build toward was going to be. Well, we realized pretty quickly we needed to step back and figure out, you know, some ways of supporting that was at least in some way doable. So don't mean this as a blame, but it ended up that there are a lot of things that got started, but pretty much they got added on top of what districts used to do. So, but despite this, we have great stuff going on, and we have districts that are organizing in very strategic ways. And the districts we are profiling, we'll have a bunch more of these that we're going to be publishing coming up. But I'm just going to walk through one just to give you an example of how we think about this. What we mean when we say a strategic approach is that they actually have an overarching strategy that they're trying to pursue in their district about how they're going to improve student performance, and that they align their ESSER resources with that strategy. So it's a way of extending that strategy and going on, not a thing we're doing that's separate. And I will say that some districts had their ESSER team and that was separate from their strategy team, and the two weren't necessarily meeting. You know, and they were managed in very different ways. But the districts that made a big difference with these dollars were starting out ahead already. They had a strategy and they wove this into it. They made investments in proven high impact strategies. I'll talk about what we mean by that in a minute. And they were very careful about measuring their progress along the way, not just looking at outcomes, which take a while sometimes to be generated, but looking at the early learning indicators and the indicators of whether they were even doing the thing at all before they said it's not working. Important for two reasons, right? Important because a model that's injected from the outside always needs to be modified to fit the context and to adjust to what you learn. So collecting that data is a super important part of that. And secondly, these districts knew they were going to have to make the case to sustain the spending in these areas, and they were going to need to have the data to show that that was working. This is an area extremely underinvested in across the nation, across districts, and most districts don't even have the analytic capacity to begin to do this on their own. And we were urging districts that they were doing, but this was a perfectly legitimate use of ESSER dollars to really understand what works to promote student recovery. And then the last thing that they're doing is this do now build toward approach. The idea that the small thing you do right now, if you're doing it with a longer term vision, you might do the first thing slightly differently, and think differently about how you do it with that vision in mind. I can give more examples of that if you want. But when we say investing in power strategies or the proven impact strategies, we talk about 5 of them, and the districts that we work with really organize their work largely around what are we doing in each of these 5 areas to accelerate learning. And many of them picked only a couple to really focus in on in terms of that. And so this is the first one is, do we have rich curriculum instruction materials to use and our teachers using it well to meet the moment? Time and attention, are we giving attention to students when they need it? To help them recover. Improving the teaching job. Do we have the best teachers we need? Are we keeping them? Are we rewarding them? The relationships and social emotional support. This became, you know, as you know, who are the educators in here, it became sort of paramount in the work that we're doing. How are we organizing resources to do that, both short and what are we learning about what we're doing short term to think about what we might do better long term? And lastly, how do we engage communities and families in this work? Because there's no way schools could do this all, even though many schools and school leaders did try to do this all on their own. So the things on the left here are examples of what districts did. I mean, it was an explosion of new ways of doing things. I mean, districts changed how they organized their schedules literally overnight. They went to AB days. They had kids coming in and out. They had teachers playing all sorts of different roles. They were using technology across their whole schools. This was, we were moaning about how we could never get digital access or, scale use of technology. And now it's a given in these places. And yet we have not organized in ways that make this part of the coherent way that schools are organized, that shift resources to enable those things to continue. And that's the opportunity before us. But it is different than the moment we came in with. This moment is, you can do it, you just did. You can shift all these things and do things differently. But how do we do that in an organized, coherent way that actually embraces choices and trade-offs? So the Nashville Public Schools is a high poverty district like many others that we worked with. They went into the pandemic with a huge focus on literacy. They came out of the pandemic. Their growth numbers will be even better this year, we think, based on early diagnostics. So back up to pre-pandemic levels. Their math is very similar. How did they do this? They focused their resources on literacy reimagined. So this is just the chart of how they spent their ESSER funds, and they spent over a third of it on their literacy initiatives. And they spent another chunk of it on a pillar that they call Every Student Known, which has gotten national attention about how they support relationships between families and students in a very deliberate fashion. They did so in what I call the do now, build toward way. So every time they made an investment, let's say in high quality curriculum and instruction, they thought about how they were going to sustain that. They brought in outside coaches. Well, who's going to do that long term? Because we're not going to be able to afford to spend $7 million every year on instructional coaches, those kinds of things. And like I was saying, they were very clear about what they were measuring and how they were measuring it and how they were reporting this. For every Nashville, there's a Hartford. And so Hartford also went into it with a strong strategy that was based on the work they had done on strategy and picked 4 big areas to invest their dollars in. If you're quick studies, you can see that this is about more time and support for students who need it, more support for teachers to do a good job in instruction, more PD, every student known kinds of things. And they have a huge teacher shortage and turnover challenge. So they were using some of those dollars, plan to use some of those dollars. Fast forward to 21-22, the gray is what they didn't spend in this plan. This is true all over the place. And why didn't they spend it? It wasn't because they didn't try. It was because who was hiring, who was taking a job during COVID, who was wanting to teach in the schools, all of those different things. There were pieces of it that they didn't implement as well as they might, but then, we're talking about people coming in and out of school and staying home, and central offices suddenly depleted. So they did not spend their money. They actually did go to their board with all this information and make a change in their plan that had more likelihood of being spent. They will still come out of this with some more dollars to spend this year. And they will come out with a deficit that was before the ESSER and continues after the ESSER moment. So local and state funding has decreased over that time. It's not just the cliff that is going to be hitting them, and expenses in every district have gone up over that period of time. So deficit is getting worse. We just finished a study that will be coming out in 10 days if you're interested, because we also hope people will repeat this analysis. But we were able to look at 3 states to try to understand where they will be coming into this year in terms of their overall deficit, because the data on spending is just so murky and hard to get at. So we looked at high poverty districts and what their recurring spending would be, and what their recurring spending obligations would be, and what their recurring revenue would be without those ESSER dollars. And we found 5 things. The first one is that most of these districts are coming out with a deficit, of spend. So they are going into this period of time having to make some cuts, some tough choices and trade-offs. Secondly, some districts won't. So it's really important to look at the variation and what's causing it. The big factor here is declining enrollment, and lots of these districts are in the conditions of declining enrollment, both because of market pressures, but often because of demographic pressure. It's just changing right now, especially at the elementary school level. The birth rate is lower, enrollment is declining, and the 4 years of the pandemic kind of masked a lot of that overall trend. And then teacher salaries did go up, but not as much probably as they need to go up given inflation and kind of the overall pressure. So we're heading into a time where lots of tough choices and trade-offs need to be made. And as I said, we can either hunker down, cut the system that wasn't working, or think differently about that. I love this chart so much, so please look at it again, but I'm not going to go through it. It's about thinking about the vicious cycle that districts face when they're in this moment of cutting resources. And the first thing that goes are things like art, music, PE, all of the professional learning, all of those things. So you get down to a system where the haves leave, the teachers who can leave, and the intense needs are concentrated in these districts, raising the cost of serving them without increasing the total in a context of declining revenues. So you're facing a district's situation that it turns into this absolute vicious cycle. You can get out of it by cutting, but that just exacerbates the cycle. So just a minute on transformation, because we could have a whole session on it. Let's just take high school. It's a moment of extreme pressure on high school. We're hoping it's an opening for really new ways of doing high school, because they did switch up in ways that high schools haven't for the last 2 decades. We know schools are off track. We have huge credit recovery needs. We have a lot of students that need to take so many more courses than they could possibly fit in their schedules as they are now. And we know that student engagement is at an all-time low, meaning that we need to think differently about how we engage students, organize instruction, and those kinds of things. Districts all over the country are creating these inspiring visions about what they want to create for students. Standards aligned work, anytime, anywhere learning, teachers who have the energy to support them and have relationships with them, opportunities to work in internships and take early college credits and advanced coursework, all of this. What you don't hear in those conversations is how people, time, and money need to shift in order to do that. That doesn't happen on its own. And to expect school leaders to do that is nonsense. This is not something that individual school leaders can address as a whole. Thinking differently about how time is used, having totally different sequences of learning and rich curriculum to draw from, time and roles that are really different, sort of partnerships and use of technology that supplements all this learning, very different sorts of time and sort of different wellness supports. These require new compensation systems. These require new school designs and learning programs, very different staffing and teaming models, schedules, and ways of delivering. We can be doing all sorts of online coursework, but not in the way we currently are funding and organizing schools. We can't do those things at scale. And so the point here is that this is not something we can be blaming district leaders or school leaders for not doing. We do see some school leaders doing it in various places and exceptions, but at this moment, we need this to happen at scale, and we need to have it faster than it can happen on a one-by-one basis. So the question is, what the heck are we going to do about this? And how are we going to support the sort of choices and trade-offs that we want districts to be making, instead of doing the more typical sorts of ways they're going to go into these cuts with, across the board class size reductions or increases, for which you could buy all these different things. And similarly, I'm sorry, I have these animated, but similarly, we're going to be looking at district unions, so we just are seeing in Newton, raising the across the board salaries, foregoing all sorts of more strategic things they could be doing to change the teacher role and to adjust the shape of the salary and compensation curve. So I have to said this, but this embraces all of your work, because it is about what is the data we need to be able to tell these stories. What are the policies that we can create that create accountability, but the flexibility that we need in order to do the work that we need to do, and how can we support the creation of these new models and the understanding that needs to surround them to enable communities to adapt and adopt those models? So that I did in 25 minutes. The key takeaway. So please leave being really curious about this crossroads and how you might get involved in helping.
Thank you. Aaron invited you to leave, but don't leave yet.
Yeah.
We've got plenty of time for questions and comments and thoughts and reactions. Why don't I start with a question, but if you all could think about what you might like to ask Karen to follow up, that would be great. Their policy obviously is one of the three categories you were showing there at the end. And let's focus on state policy in particular. There's some things that a state could do, depending on the particular circumstances, to create more flexibility and more capacity for school districts to take advantage of that opportunity to do some of the things you're just talking about. I guess my question is, how do you move from, or should you move from giving more flexibility and perhaps more resources to create more opportunity for districts to change, as opposed to requiring change or putting in place not just incentives, but maybe even some mandates to drive change? Because I think obviously we're in a moment, and this is probably always true and always has been, of sort of some crisis or inflection. And in the absence of a real stimulus to quick, but hopefully effective action, this is a very slow process, may never happen, and, feels like it's a little discouraging. So I guess the question is, how far do you think states can go from a policy perspective in order to not just encourage, but, for lack of a better word, to force these things to happen? Or is that even a reasonable approach?
So it's so interesting because I've now been doing this almost 30 years. And I started doing it with urban districts who almost always viewed the state as an enemy. So I kind of came at this, like they were always telling them what to do, and that's so annoying, and let us do our own thing. I see some people nodding, maybe you've experienced that, but so that was what I sort of came in with. And my opinion has changed dramatically by seeing some really driven, pretty rapid change and sort of a different kind of focus. So I'll give you a couple examples. I do think mandates in some areas, like that you have to use proven curriculum in the science of reading, like why do we need to, why do we need to have people invent this if we have all this data that do this? So I think some sort of mandate. I think I've seen we see states where they have a mandate, but there's also, if you can show outcomes, you can choose a different thing. And that needs to, I think, always be part of any sort of solution in terms of doing this. So I do think some mandates are really important. I'm not sure, we're trying to think about what the line is, what are the things you would mandate and not. What I see happening, for an example, in Texas, of all places, is incredibly powerful. And just let me take a minute on it, because what they're doing is they have a vision that schools actually need to look significantly different. And they have passed legislation that gives more money they don't give a lot of, so it's starting from a low base, please be clear. But then they have allocated more to the schools with the greatest need in a multi-billion-dollar legislative package, just as a base. And then they are allocating resources to 4 or 5 different areas that change the structures of schooling. One deals with expanding learning time. They've created a combination of incentives and supports to do this, some of which are seriously rich, where they'll pay for half the cost of these things, and also technical support to do it, and also supporting cohorts of districts trying to learn how to do it. They did it with expanded learning. They are forcing changes in teacher compensation, doing the same thing. They've got incentive structures where teachers can earn upwards of $120,000 if they teach in high poverty schools, with the way, if districts use them in the way that they envisioned. They have a similar across a host of different, I'll call it a high school redesign. And so they are organizing to create big incentives to do these things, and then support around doing them. And the support around doing them, Jim, is also interesting. They've got a whole strand around using technology as well. And you can get support, you can choose one or two, three different options, two that they've vetted that are curated, and you get a ton of money for doing so. And a third that's do it yourself. So, you apply to get this money and most everybody chooses one or two. And some go to the extra effort to do it themselves. The last thing I'll say about what they've done is they have a very serious accountability system. Starts very low, I'm saying low. But they have they continuously raise the bar. And so a bunch of districts that said all of their schools were Bs, now all their schools are DNF this year because they raised the bar, and those districts are doing all sorts of things to try to, and they're publishing research that is showing that the districts that implement these pieces of the puzzle are the ones that are generating the results. So it's like this beautiful system you could draw up in a policy class about how you would create accountability, incentives, and support, and then data to sort of demonstrate that. That's sort of, and I could talk about what's going on in Maryland if you want, or some other places around how states are really moving the needle on this, and how so many states are just not. And so the question is where that leadership is going to come from. And I have some interesting stories about where that's emerging too.
Great, really helpful. Marty, you have a question?
Sure. So, you went where I was headed in terms of asking about the state role, because as I heard you talking, it seemed like all these districts were out there sort of making these decisions on their own. And so some of them faced constraints on their ability to hire, to follow through on their plans, in the Hartford example. But they're, it seemed like a picture of them making these decisions individually. So one force shaping their decisions is the role of state policy, and it's been more active in some states than in others. Another constraint that you alluded to at the end, by referring to what happened in Newton, is the need to, in most places, negotiate all of this with the union.
Yes.
How important is that in as a barrier to being able to go in the direction you highlighted in terms of using resources well to improve teaching?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's huge, and it's something I've struggled with for the last 25 years. And it's, so I want to be clear, like the reasons union contracts exist is because somebody screwed up somewhere that required that thing in the union to exist, right? But now we're in a place where you don't get to transformation by negotiating on an existing system. So, and the challenge is, like, if you're putting a new compensation up for a democratic vote and you have a bunch of teachers who are not going to get as big of an increase because others are going to get a much bigger increase, it's not likely to pass. And there are lots of examples of, we did a union collaboration that I was part of in Cincinnati years ago, where they revised the compensation system. The union agreed to it. And they had these peer evaluators, so you would get much more if you were highly evaluated. Sure enough, only a small percentage of teachers were evaluated at the highest level. And guess what? The union voted it out the following year. And the union leaders that were part of the negotiation were also kicked out from the district. So, so part of what ERS is part of is this national, they're helping to lead a national coalition on re-envisioning the teaching job, where it needs to be part of a larger conversation that says we can't get there from here. Like, there's another way we have to organize this if we want to be able to pay, the best teachers who take on the most responsibility and have the most expertise, the same kinds of compensation levels that other professionals who are expert and experienced make. I don't know how that's
just a quick follow-up. I think
Yeah.
it's related to Jim's question in the sense that maybe there needs to be more state mandate or resources. What you described in Texas sounded almost like coercion, but like sort of forcing districts to do some things that are going to be impossible for them to do on their own, given the political incentives within the union
Yes.
at the local level.
Yeah, that's what wondering, is how do you create those kinds of situations, or create those spaces where, you're forgoing so much, those grand bargains, if you will, you're forgoing so much additional revenue or opportunity by not engaging in this shift, that you can't justify it in your own community. And I've seen that happen in little ways, like, join the group insurance fund because it's half the cost of yours. And then being very public about what that means for the local community schools that don't choose that option, and what the cost of that is in terms of instruction. So there's ways of kind of making, yeah. I don't know how you get communities also to push back on it. So interesting. Like in Denver, just to quickly on the Denver thing, they did so much work to pay teachers more who worked in the highest poverty schools and those kinds of things. Then the board changed, the union came in, and literally, how can you argue against paying teachers more who work in the highest poverty schools with the toughest stuff? And yet they voted it out. So, but there was no community pushback, because that had not been organized in such a way where people understood that this was good. And so that this was good for equity and good for the community and that kind of thing. So, I hope maybe there's a piece of this around community activation, but I think there's a piece of it that's about creating a context where it's so difficult not to do these things.
Karen, why don't you just.
Yeah.
pick your-
Yeah.
Lisa.
Kind of building on where Marty went a little bit, the unions can be a barrier. And so districts that have a strong union presence, or as a state, Massachusetts, might need to think of a different entry point in terms
Yeah.
of all of these different ways that you can reorganize schooling. And I'm wondering what ERS has found, or what you've seen people doing in terms of either state or district level, evaluating the most high impact entry point to try to leverage how to make these changes as they're building towards hopefully a more transformative change.
Yeah, and can I just, so now I'm remembering that you prompted us to say we're on recording, and I want to be really clear. I want to be really clear that, this has been a thing we need to be, we are working on districts where unions are really an important presence and part of this thing, and we need to be able to do that work because that's where the need is. And I still want to say there are other ways to get out of this that require a longer term, more collaborative approach to re-envisioning what it could be. On your point, I do think that this can happen through kind of pilots and experiments where you're organizing in different ways and collecting great data on how this is working for folks. And so you've seen in a number of districts around teaching, for an example, that it turns out that teachers, it's a big sticking point to have teachers evaluating other teachers. But it turns out that when you do that really well, teachers actually love being evaluated by someone who knows how to teach really well, and gives them feedback that's very specific in doing that. And so doing different things in a way where you're approaching it from a learning mindset and sharing that data is really going to be a super important part of this change process, we think. So getting started in certain schools, and really showcasing what's happening in Indianapolis. We created really new schedules that required a lot of collaborative planning time and significantly more flexibility. Only 6 schools wanted to do it the first year, but now we have 18 schools the next year who are excited about it because teachers loved having 2 days a week to do whatever they wanted. And they were willing to make the sacrifices to do it. So I do think there's a way, but and so that is the way that we're working with districts to try to do that, and engaging the union membership in helping to craft that.
Have you ever seen, or what examples have you seen of then that practice informing policy? So you have some pilots and then it grows and more people. Have you seen that codified into policy, or what moves might we be able to make to help? Okay, now we have a proof point. How do we make that more now coming back?
Yeah, I think that I think deliberate efforts at that, right? And that I feel like there's so much promise right now. We're trying to organize around and encourage people to organize around these cohorts of learners doing, cohorts of districts doing these new kinds of things organized against some research-backed principles about what might work, doing these things together and doing it with the purpose of informing state policy, and often doing it in the context of relief from, various constraints and things, explicit permission and incentives. The other thing I would add about the Texas context is that the state is funding a bunch of this, and philanthropists are funding this also in a host of different ways, national and local are sort of joining in to support all of this. And there's a deliberate on-ramp policy, so much so that the work they did around the expanded learning day, the thing they structured, it didn't really work for most districts. And so some chose not to do it. But the beauty was they had the structures in place where they could realize why. And so then they revamped it. They meet only every other year, so it took a while. But they they did revamp it a bit in order to sort of adjust. So I do think, and I think that's happening across the country in things that aren't sponsored by states, but are sponsored by philanthropists or just organic movements that are also deliberately trying to inform state policy. But ideally, the state is actually proactively trying to learn from that and inform what they're doing and picking the areas they want to learn in.
Thank you so much for your presentation today. Really resonates. I recently had a chance to start working with a network of high schools that are reimagining learning that's less time and seat-bound.
Nice.
And that fits in with,
Yeah.
an element that
Yeah.
you're speaking about. The one reality that's true is all these proof points are sort of developing double bookkeeping practices
Yeah.
because they still have to fit within current policies.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking about that in juxtaposition with the fiscal cliff you're describing, in particular, well, not just the cliff, but the budget realities for districts with concentrated poverty.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, through this process of reimagining, are you concerned that this budget reality is going to exacerbate the opportunity gap for those reimagining in that, in particularly in those districts? And what are you thinking about our best practices to make sure that marginalized populations are centered in this reimagination as opposed to address down the line budget comes in?
Yeah, it is the question that we grapple with. It's such a good question. Yeah, there's so many parts of that question. The first one that is just about like, are these districts going to be the highest poverty districts going to be able to even have the wherewithal and the resources to do the reimagining work that's needed? And I think the answer is no. And that's why there's state and federal response that is needed around this. This is not work you just sit and do. It's like, I took a Harvard grad school of ed class once where they had us write a short little bit of curriculum, like for something, and we were like, this is nuts. Oh my God. And we all thought we were so smart, like, this is crazy. We can't possibly do this. The idea that we would all over the place be reinventing things not informed by research, not informed by what everyone else has learned is ridiculous. But mounting an individual district effort to try to do this without technical support or models to draw from is just not. So I don't think they can do it on their own. And that's why I'm saying there needs to be concerted effort to support those districts in doing that. And not only that, the financial situation in that doom loop that I described is not one that the districts are going to be able to get out of on their own. We're working with districts all over the country that have way too many schools. And figuring out how to, and they'll go through the painful process of closing schools, which is highly political and all of that. And I can tell you 5 or 6 of them we've just gone through, and they just went through this whole process. Some of the superintendents lost their jobs in the process, and they need to close 10 or 15 more. And so this is not something that individual districts can be doing, and while they're beaten up every single day while doing it, and still be working on improving instruction. So this is something that does require a concerted effort. And some states only have 3 or 4 of those. So there's a way in which states can organize to support those districts. It's very different than what we're doing now. But I do think those power strategies that I'm mentioning, that I reviewed, are the ones that are research-based about what we need to be doing in those schools. in terms of, focusing more resources on raising the bar, having rich instruction, creating relationships and relevance. So I think there's a rich set of data around the kinds of things that can happen. There just needs to be more work around promulgating different ways of organizing to do that and making it possible. And also much more explicitly understanding what the cost of that is and how to, I can say more about that, but.
Yeah, I would love to go back to what you said about having some stories to share around Maryland. Alia, Angelique, and I, and JoJo sort of are working with Prince George's County, which is one of the largest districts in Maryland,
We know,
right, and
yeah.
in the country.
Yeah.
And so they're really sort of reeling from the release of the Maryland Blueprint, and some of the things that we've heard are like, it's like trying to turn a cruise ship on a dime. So I'm wondering if you could provide sort of, one, just any stories that you have around the implementation of that legislation, and two, just thinking about like context specific implementation, right? When you're working with a district that large versus when you're working with a smaller district that may be more nimble and more, open and receptive to help, and just sort of any thoughts about that.
That's a lot of questions.
So many.
So for people that don't know what Maryland did, it's a little bit in the lines of what I was talking about with Texas. So they also, it's called something else before the blueprint, but there's a piece of that legislation that increased the spend based on the concentration of poverty and other needs. And to the point where these districts were getting a lot more if they had concentrated poverty and those kinds of things. And they passed a host of teacher legislation, the gist of which was to give a truckload more money to school districts over a 10-year period. That was also weighted by poverty for implementing, but they had to implement a new teacher leadership program. And they were very specific about what this would look like. It needed to, you get the extra money by getting the National Board Teacher Standards and BPTS.
Yep.
You get the extra money for that, which hasn't been proven to necessarily link with outcomes, but that is part of the legislation. So you get that money. Then the legislation specifies that all teachers would teach only 60% of the day. And right now, to give you, because it was designed to change the teaching role and make it more sustainable. Right now, teachers in elementary schools teach about 80% of the day if you take out planning and lunch, and maybe 75% of the day. So saying 60%, depending on how you define it, is a big, like the math of that is a lot. So just that's the background. There's a separate accountability board that they set up to sort of make sure that you're doing it, that kind of thing. But it's very specific what you do. We were working with Baltimore City Public Schools. It's not necessarily what these districts would choose to do, even if they were choosing to do a teacher, re-envisioning the teacher role and leadership role. So this is the moment where that's sort of playing out. What's wonderful about it is it's said, you got to do this. They're giving a ton of money to do it. The question is whether they're going to learn from this attempt to implement it and kind of adapt what they're asking for and stay true to the principles of what they're trying to enable rather than the specifics, which, you never get those exactly right. But I wasn't involved in, I don't know who, crafted the specifics on that. So that was part of your question. The other part is, yes, the context matters a lot. And so I think one thing that hasn't shown through all of that is what are the kind of non-negotiables? What are the principles that they're trying to ensure happen in these districts and enabling districts to find other ways to get to that? So what we're seeing in the Maryland context is, and we're running communities of practice in Maryland, they're just looking like going down the list and seeing how can I check that thing off without like, how can I don't know, okay, 60%, what can I count as instruction so I can get to the 60%, not what I'm trying to do is free time for reflection and learning and all of that stuff. And so it's just an interesting question. I think that the answer is that that it's going back to, what is it we're trying, you know, my chart is, what are we trying to do here? What are we trying to create here? Going back to that and saying, so what are we gonna do? That's why this is gonna play out in so many different ways. We can't mandate exactly how it's gonna play out in all of these places, because it doesn't need to play out in the same way. But we do need to know that we've created sustainable, rewarding, challenging jobs for teachers. And we do have a lot of research about what that likely includes. So I don't know if that's helpful, but we're working in Prince Williams too. So it's well, that's not, that is, yeah. No, that's Virginia. That's Virginia. It's the two princes. Yeah.
So if I could go around again.
Yeah.
So I want to ask a question about the role of organizations like ERS,
Mhm.
Education Resource Strategies. And there'll be a skeptical part and then a sympathetic part. So and you skipped over, I think, a slide at the very beginning of your presentation, I think would have shown us the districts that you're working with
Yeah.
and where you're getting a lot of the information and perspective. So the like skeptical part of the question is, you're working obviously with a selected group of the nation's 14,000 school districts. And I'm wondering, these are districts that maybe they're facing particular challenges, which lead them to reach out to an organization like you all. But maybe they're also more open to some of the ideas that you all have been advancing around time, people, and money and how to use them well. And so do we get too optimistic a perspective of what's going on nationally from drawing on your organization's experience? So that's the skeptical part.
Yeah.
The sympathetic part is the other thought I kept having while you were talking is I wish every district had the opportunity to work with an external partner like you all that has the ability to learn from experiences across places in a more systematic way.
Yeah.
I don't want to give you all a total monopoly though. So I wondered, like, you know, I was trying to think about what we could do. Like, would it make sense for districts to somehow be required to partner with an external organization? I was thinking of what Joel Klein did in New York City at some point where
Yeah.
schools had to partner with
Yeah.
not a particular support organization, but one of a set.
Yeah.
Would something like that at the district level
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah. So the skeptical part first, yeah, you know, we started this organization that said, well, our theory of action wasn't that we were going to fix all school districts. Our theory of action was that we would naively, we would create some shining examples of school districts that created great schools at scale in partnership with these amazing leaders. And then we would share the research and lessons and tools around that. So yes, I mean, and so we feel our job is to be spreading a sense of possibility and understanding what it would take to do that. And we do run some networks as in Texas with 65 districts where that are on a whole range of readiness for this work. And we do so in Tennessee and a couple other states, Massachusetts as an example. And so we are developing out tools and materials that are trying to get at this other level of readiness and openness and start to spread that. So we feel like our role is to try to create an ecosystem and a demand for that kind of leadership and work. And that there's absolutely this other piece of work that's about like, what is it like on average in all of these places? So, but on the idea of the support, yeah, I do think, and so, yes, I do think districts need help to do this. And for a host of reasons, even if the leader knows exactly what to do, which they wouldn't have had the experience or perspective to be able to do. But even if they did, having that outside support and perspective and sort of someone to come in and go, like, yeah, we've seen this in 5 different places and here are the big things that tend to go wrong. It's just really helpful and important when you're trying to instigate change.
Or convince a board.
Or convince a
that,
board
like,
or,
These
yeah,
people told us that's the job of McKinsey,
exactly.
right? Is to
Yeah.
tell you what you
Yeah.
want to do. Anyways.
Yeah, and so, I mean, in Texas, they had a whole thing where they required a partner. And they went through a process of selecting a curated set of partners. You get 20% more per pupil if you chose to work with a partner. So it's, these states are putting dollars behind these requirements. You don't get the money if you don't do the thing, but these are the districts that are outperforming the others. And so they have this, the data that says, you did this, look how different the results are in these places, and look at the shifts that they're making in terms of doing it. But most places and boards, I mean, like right now, we thought we staffed up and geared up to be ready for this moment right now, because this is the time when districts need to be thinking strategically about their resources. But boards right now are not thinking, oh, we need to go spend money on an outside technical support group to help us think about reimagining schools. They're like, no, we need to put this money into more classroom teachers. And so it,
Well, that's why they need to be required, they
Yeah.
need to be required to do it, right?
I think so. And states don't have the capacity to provide that sort of assistance. So it's they're providing the resources in order to enable that kind of assistance to happen. But there aren't that many organizations that do this. And that's another part of the ecosystem that needs to evolve. Because the people that end up doing this work often are the, well, if it's on the budget side, it's like, how do I cut the budget? Which, oh, I'll get teacher, which I'm not kidding you. I've seen these very respected management consultant agencies saying the way to reduce costs is to have teachers teach 7 periods instead of 6. Because do the math, that saves a bunch of money. But so to do it in the context of what we're trying to accomplish in terms of student experience and in terms of learning.
Hey, Michael, are there any questions in the chat?
There's one bit of a minefield.
Oh, absolutely. Let's do that one.
If Biden or Trump were to win a second term in 2024, months after ESSER funding ends, what do you believe each one would do to continue addressing this issue?
I can't do it. I can't do that because, I mean, we know what happened in the, in Trump's administration before, which was that basically we had a Department of Education that just didn't particularly engage. They said certain things, but there wasn't much that happened. And there were some folks that wrote it out they stayed on from the Obama, and they stayed in the system, and they did get some things done, but they didn't step out and try to lead in any way on these issues particularly, except some of the things that they said that were challenging. And I think if Biden, I would expect more of the same from Biden, and they're doing more around teacher, investing in teacher, thinking differently about teaching roles and things like that. So that is important. I think the federal government can play a big role here, but the action is at the state level right now. The action is at the state level. And so either group needs to be thinking about how they can support states to do great work.
My question kind of builds off your question, but I'm curious. I was in Tennessee before this, and so I have some experience with the school districts there. And I feel like Metro Nashville is kind of like an island in a sea of red. And I'm curious if you have any experience working with rural school districts, and are they as open-minded to these strategies as more metro school districts are, and kind of what does that look like?
Yeah. We actually did work with a cohort of districts in Tennessee with an amazing advocacy and reform support group called Tennessee SCORE. And they have relationships with a host of different districts. And what I would say is, some are open, some are not, in terms of the rural places, but they are in many ways must be more open to different ways of organizing, because, and we've learned a lot, like we're in there talking about, you need a team of geometry teachers. Like we have one geometry teacher and he's our football coach, so it's like, the whole set of strategies is really different there. And, offering advanced coursework and rich offerings is going to demand using online and other kinds of ways of doing things. So I think there's a way in which, that disrupting class that Chris Christensen wrote, if you read that, where if you have nothing, then you're open to something, even if it's, because it's something is better than nothing. So there's lots of opportunities, I think, in some of these rural areas to do things differently, especially as it relates to teacher staffing models and bringing in technology and what adults do and how communities are, and how community other resources are engaged. So, and we have all these do-it-yourself tools, and we've seen some of those leaders, like, pick them up and use them. So I think there is an urgency for sure. And there'll be a lot of urgency around the places that are losing enrollment, because they're going to have to think differently about school design. Like we just can't, you can't run a school in the same way if you have 100 students in your elementary school, which some of these rural districts do. So.
And Karen, can we go back to the recovery versus redesign? Maybe I should say versus, but these two, either different or parallel approaches. So I think if you talk to educators today and policymakers, they would probably tell you we're still heavily in recovery mode, right? And that the approaches or the issues that are challenging and consuming resources are things like, how to afford high dosage tutoring, how to address chronic absenteeism, how to deal with mental health and behavioral health issues, as well as, sort of on the fiscal side, rising inflation, stagnating or declining tax revenues. I mean, it all sounds pretty bad the way I just described, right? If what you're trying to do is to initiate or deepen investment in the redesign work. And I totally get your point that from a sustainability point of view, unless you do the redesign, you're never going to be able to afford additional investments in all these sort of more, for lack of a better word, recovery activities. But given the moment that we're in and the urgency, what's urgent versus what's important, is there a way out of that sort of what seems like a very difficult trade-off?
Yeah, well, in business, I started my career at a management consulting firm. In business, you would restructure or go bankrupt. And you would, and that costs a lot of money, right? You'd invest a lot in the translation, you'd erase a bunch of the debt, you'd get started over again. And I remember I did learning sessions now years ago with Arnie Duncan's administration around resources in use. And they were like, what if we started a bankruptcy program for urban districts? They could, and then they got all excited about it for a minute. And then it was like, this is not going to go over well for a minute. But it's something like that. I mean, I really do think that we need to realize that it's going to take infusions of resources to be able to get to redesign. It's not going to happen while we're cutting these other things. And yet, to Lisa's question, the tutoring thing, for an example, like, we are, through the tutoring work, learning lower cost ways of getting some of those impacts. So I just talked with Alan Saffron, who runs Saga, which is the nonprofit high dosage tutoring thing. And they now have a model that seems to be generating really great results that uses college students on work study programs and really rich tutoring, support through AI and all sorts of other things that is much lower cost. And so figuring out how to incorporate that and create schedules, which we can do that don't cost a ton more, that weave that into the school day, are things that, you can start to do some of these things with even within the existing budget, with the will and the proof. The trick is even those conflict with some of the union contracts, the way that they're written now and how those have to happen. So having the really strong data about what the results of that can be is going to be an important part of making this case in those places. But it's not an either or. We can do some of it, but in some places I think there's going to be a need for a greater degree of intervention and external support to get that turnaround to happen. Just like we knew that schools needed support for a period of time in order to get to turnaround. This is similar for districts, and states can take over districts. They are supposed to take over districts when they aren't performing at a certain level. And you see very few states exercising that, right? Texas took over Houston. Holy moly, we could have a whole nother session on what's going on there, but they just took over Houston, and and Mike Miles is trying to invent an entirely new school system and structure all at once. And so, yeah, and so, and Massachusetts did some takeovers.
I think this,
Yeah.
your do now builds towards paradigm is useful here, because there may be some do nows which seem to be fairly incremental, because there's all this other stuff that, you know, in sort of in
Yes,
the recovery
right,
dimension
right.
that still needs to happen. But in part, the way you may do some of that recovery, in part in terms of
Yes.
the sort of newer initiatives that you may
Mhm.
launch, having some clarity around where you're trying to
Yes,
go
yeah.
might at least provide some forward momentum, even as all this other stuff.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much. And I think the mindset is so important. One that really people can get right away is like, if you hire substitutes, for an example, just to hire substitutes and fill the classroom, you do it a certain way. But if you view substitutes maybe as a potential pipeline into future teachers that could increase the diversity of your teaching force and so on, you would do that differently. You would keep track of who came in, you would actually, and you viewed them as a way of actually, you wanted to be ensure they were doing something of quality. You would do some training that was different, and you would do some selection that was different, and you would reward the ones that came back. So there are ways you can do those little things that are building towards, we want a diverse, multiple set of pipelines, bringing people into teaching, bringing the best people that we can find into teaching, and you do it in a different way. So, and that's what we're trying to get folks doing.
Any more questions?
Do you think the schools should maintain their capacity to offer remote and or hybrid learning, or we can use that capacity to do something else, evolve it?
I think there's just huge opportunity to leverage technology in different ways at all levels of schooling, elementary, middle, and high. Everything from how do we connect with kids before and after school? How do we connect with families after school? What do we do when kids miss school? What are kids doing for homework versus when they're in the classroom? All of those kinds of things. And I also think, and we've got a bunch of tools around, we're calling it blended learning, sometimes hybrid learning at high school level, about how you leverage all this great stuff that's coming out around amazing curriculum material that is using great instructors to share that material online. And how do you incorporate that into your high school structure? It's not, as research around blended learning years ago showed, it's not necessarily lower cost, but it is lower cost it can be lower cost and shift cost structures if you organize at scale to do it. If you're doing it as a little course here and a little course there, then it's not lower cost. But if you're saying, I'm creating schedules and structures that shift resources away from those courses, those elective courses and those advanced courses, to leverage these things and put them into other things, or reduce the overall cost, then it does change cost structure. So I do think, and I think the technology piece has a huge opportunity to change the teaching job, make it easier, more sustainable, and all of those kinds of things if it were incorporated. So I think it's just a really exciting opportunity.
So I think we're basically out of time. Any closing remarks, optimistic or otherwise, you'd like to leave us with?
I don't know. I feel like this has been a great discussion. I really enjoyed it. I'd be super happy to follow up with folks. I've got more on every single thing I talked about here on our website, and that's coming up. And I'm hoping that we'll have a lot more. And if you do come up with any brilliant ideas to get out of this little mold that we have, this moment we have for some of these districts, please let us know. We're trying to think of moonshot kinds of solutions here that we could start to integrate into the conversation. So
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it. Hopefully we'll see you all next week.